The Master and His Emissary, 2009. So, Ian, it's a great see you again. I'm so glad we have a chance to talk.
And it's great to be talking with you again, Jordan. Thanks. That our brains are divided and that each half of the brain produces a different version of the experiential world. It takes that much further. And it takes it in particular in relation to something that I know concerns both of us, and I imagine concerns many viewers and listeners, which is the devastatingly reduced vision of the world that we now have, this reductive materialist ideology, which is absolutely not compelled on us, as people seem to think, by science or by reason. It's a version of the world which is very much consonant with the view that one of the hemispheres of our brain takes, the left hemisphere. And we shouldn't be paying too much attention to what it has to say, except for the business of getting our daily bread. But actually, in terms of understanding the world, it's the right hemisphere that helps us here. And in what you said in your introduction, you suggested that I think context is very, very important. In fact, context is everything. Context can completely change the meaning of any situation, of any words, or anything that we're trying to put across. And the right hemisphere is able to take in this broader context. Perhaps I'll just say something very brief about that. From an evolutionary point of view, we know that all the brains we've looked at, going way back into prehistory, all seem to have this divided structure. And indeed, the oldest neural network, that of a sea anemone called Nematostella vectensis, 700 million years old, is already asymmetrical, which is a fascinating fact. You know, why would it be asymmetrical? The world isn't asymmetrical in that way. And it seems that this is because all brains have to do two things at once, each of which could take up the whole attention of the brain. That is basically to focus on a detail so that you can grab it, and at the same time not yourself become prey to someone else who wants to grab you. So there's two kinds of attention that we all need to be able to pay. How we get food. I give the image sometimes of a bird picking up a seed on the background of grit or gravel and being able to get it swiftly, accurately, and before anybody else. But if it's only paying that kind of attention, it will soon become somebody else's lunch while it's getting its own, because it needs to be looking out for everything else that's going on, for predators, for conspecifics, for its kin, for those that it's looking after, and so on. And effectively, this is something that is constant throughout the history of evolution, but has been taken a step further in the human brain. Because we're very good at standing back from the world. Our frontal lobes are highly developed, and they enable us, as you know, to stand back from the world and to be able to see things in a more dispassionate way and to see them with more like a bird's eye view. But that has meant that we need to be able to devote a lot of time to theorizing, to mapping the world, to exploring the possible, what would happen if we did this? What would happen if we did that? And one crude and simple way of putting it is that the right hemispheres are anchor in reality. It's actually looking at what we're experiencing right now and enabling us to understand it in all its complexity, whereas the left hemisphere is giving us just a theoretical take on a certain kind of a situation.
So is it reasonable to assume, so a bunch of thoughts have been going through my mind, and part of this is you need a brain if you start to move. And if you start to move and interact with the world, then you have the problem of the part versus the whole.
That's it.
And you talked about the bird that has to distinguish something very specific, a seed against a background, let's say of pebbles.
Yeah.
But the same bird having to be concerned about the broader context for the presence of predators, for example. And so the problem is while you're focused on something specific, the rest of the world is still there. And also that the separation between the part and the rest of the world is in some manner, what would you say? It's artificial and arbitrary. Because if you're trying to eat and then you get eaten, that pretty much does in any utility of eating.
Effectively, there aren't parts. Parts are an artifact of a certain way of attending to the world. there are only wholes,
Okay, right.
and things that we think of as parts are wholes at another level, and things that we think of as wholes can be seen as parts of an even bigger whole. But this business of carving things up into parts is an artifact of the left hemisphere's piecemeal attention. So because it's trying to focus on this small detail, it's homing in on a certain little tiny bit, perhaps 3 out of the 360 degrees arc of attention.
Right.
And that leads to a different take on the world from that of the right hemisphere. And if I can just put this in a couple of simple sentences. The left hemisphere sees a world which is made up of fragments, of tiny pieces that are familiar because they're what it wants. It knows it's targeting them. They are atomistic and separate from the other parts. They're static because it freezes its target, even if it's actually following a moving target, like an eagle trying to catch a rabbit. It's, as it were, trying to fix that rabbit in the frame. And so this world is one that, this left hemisphere's version of the world, is one made up of bits that are separate, distinct, fixed, certain, decontextualized, abstract, because they've been categorized. Oh, it's one of those. No, I know.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. It's, yep.
And this effectively is an inanimate, mechanistic vision of the world. Meanwhile, the right...
Okay, so let me ask you, okay, I'll let you return to that sec. Let me ask you about that. So I'm thinking as a way to help people understand this, do you think that that's akin to the difference between listening to music, let's say a piece of music, and only hearing it note by note, and listening to a piece of music and hearing it at the level of all of the phrases, let's say, and the sequences and the totality at the same time? Because those are obviously very different things.
You could say that. And indeed, I sometimes say that the two kinds of understanding given by the hemispheres need to be combined. It's not that something's wrong with the left hemisphere's understanding. It's just that it's so very partial, so very simple compared with what it's actually, what is going on, that if we start believing the map instead of the world that's mapped, then we misunderstand. And I think that's one of the things that we're doing in our society now. But I think I need, anyway, before we go on, to be able to say something about the contrasting vision of the right hemisphere. So instead of this vision of stasis, particulate, atomistic elements that have to be put together in order to find any meaning or direction in them, the right hemisphere is seeing something which is coherent, in which nothing is ever completely separate from everything else, in which it's constantly moving, flowing, and changing, in which it's embodied, and that embodiment, like the rest of its context, makes it what it is. When you take it out of that context, it's something else completely. The right hemisphere understands the implicit, all the things that are not being said, the bits between the perceptions that make the thing rich and make it live. And in fact, this world that it creates for us is a rich, embodied, implicit, living world. And in fact, you can experimentally suppress one hemisphere at a time. And what we find is that when the left hemisphere is working alone, it does see things that we would normally see as living, as mechanisms, as zombies, as inanimate.
The left hemisphere thinks in language. Our left hemisphere is about the past and about the future, and it has a to-do list and is doing.
Whereas the right hemisphere, working alone, will see things that normally we would think of as inanimate, as animate. So it will see the sun, for example, as living, because it's a life force that's moving across the heavens.
When the hemorrhage happened, the left hemisphere got wiped out in its functions, but the right hemisphere was okay. The right hemisphere is right here, right now, and it's being, having an experience. The right hemisphere thinks in pictures. The left hemisphere thinks in language. Our left hemisphere is about the past and about the future, and it has a to-do list and is doing. So the two hemispheres just think differently. So when I lost the left hemisphere, I lost my past and I lost my future. I lost my language. I lost the identity of whom I had been and all the memories of my life. I was still capable of being in the present moment. I just was no longer connected to the portion of my brain that said, I am an individual, this is my name, this is the data of my life.
So this is this is all very simple, and for the sake of the argument and for the sake of our discussion, I've compressed an enormous amount. But I expand this, as you know, into a section of about 450 pages in the new book, looking at these hemisphere differences. This is so important to me, is that the right hemisphere sees the body as a whole, but the left hemisphere only recognizes parts. It doesn't contain the full body image, but that is in the right hemisphere.
We communicate so much, and our part detection has become so powerful. Our ability to focus in on details, technologically amplified by our ability to exchange linguistic ideas and the power of our science. And so you think maybe that as we've progressed over the last several thousand years, that intense social communication that's allowed us to parse up the world into finer and finer and more detailed bits has also suppressed our relationship with the right?
Yes, I think it has.
To me, this makes total sense that language has become an obstacle because we exclude imagery, art, play, being. We have become human doings, making noise all day long, instead of just being, experiencing, creating art or whatever.
And what I'm showing is that in all the, what I call portals, whereby we can gain information about the world, the left hemisphere is inferior to the right. So it's not just attention. I've been focusing on attention because I think it's extraordinarily important. Attention helps us construct the world that we live in. How we attend changes what we find in the world and also changes us. So it's pretty important stuff. But I'm looking at the attention, perception, which is not the same, of course, as attention, judgment, which is the kind of conclusions we draw from the basis of what we attend to and perceive, our emotional and social intelligence, our cognitive intelligence, good old-fashioned IQ, and creativity. And in all these respects, the left hemisphere is inferior to the right. And it's interesting that I look at a lot of what must be, to somebody not familiar with them, really extraordinary syndromes that are familiar to people like you and me in the world of neuropsychology and neuropsychiatry. And the ones that are characterized by the grossest delusions and hallucinations are almost exclusively due to damage to the right hemisphere, not to damage to the left. So that is a kind of important place to start, because if we're going to talk about what is the world really like, what are we really like, and you've got two versions. In the past, philosophers have said, well, some people see it like this, some people see it like that. And then they shrug their shoulders and go, but these are just two different ways of looking. We can now, I think, for the first time, and this is exciting, go further forward and say this has all the hallmarks, the characteristics of the misperceptions, the misconceptions of the left hemisphere. And this, on the other hand, has the hallmarks, the stamp of coming from the right hemisphere, which is more veridical. And so that's one reason that I need to spend some time on that particular aspect in the beginning of the book, because as we go on and, as it were, if you like, pan back a bit from those portals whereby we get information about the world to the paths that we might go down when we're trying to understand the world, like science, reason, intuition, and imagination, we need, first of all, to have established something about the degree to which each of the hemispheres can be taken to be veridical.